Hello everyone, welcome to this video on for loops, which I like to call sequence iterations. Today we're just going to talk about how a for loop works in Python 3 and how we can use them in our future programs. So what a for loop is a sequence iterator, and that may sound a little confusing and very new, so I'm just going to do a little run through of how it works. So if you examine this diagram on the left, we have the statement for iterating variable in sequence and has statements. Basically, we're learning a new keyword that helps us create a loop called a for loop. And there are two parts. We're going to have this iterating variable that represents each items in our sequence individually. So when we run into a for loop, the iterating variable is going to represent the very first item from our sequence. Then it will execute its command, goes back to the for loop, and now grab the second item from the sequence. Once again, it will execute the statement, go back, and grab the third item from the sequence. And it will continue to do this until there are no more items for the iterating variable to grab in our sequence. Then it will move on with our code. So a for loop is an iteration through items within a sequence. The iterating variable, will hold the item values for each iteration step. And this also supports nesting. So before we really get into for loops, I want to talk about sequences. A sequence is a list of things. It can be ordered or unordered. We can look at it one by one, and they can usually be ordered or shuffled or unordered. And a sequence is a finite sequence in programming, so we have a beginning and an end. So here are some examples. If I have a list of numbers 1 to 9, it will contain values from 1 to 9 inclusively. A string is an example of a sequence. So if I have this string example of sequence, it has A characters of S, E, Q, U, E, N, C, E. And there are other data types and data structures that are considered in Python iterable, as in we are able to iterate through, as in look at one by using a for loop. So to help us quickly create sequences of number, I'm going to be teaching you a new function called the range function. So what a range function does is a function that generates a sequence of numbers in an arithmetic progression. Okay? And there are three ways to use the range function depending on how many given parameters that you give it. So if I use range of n, it will develop a sequence of 0 inclusively up to n exclusively. So we'll talk about a little bit examples of this later. But if I were to have two parameters of range value, a starting value and an ending value, it will start and include the value of a and go up towards b, but not include the b. And for range of n and the range of a, b, it always increases the value by 1 on every step. Therefore, if we wanted to customize a step, we can give it three parameters: range of the starting value, the ending value, and the step we take from the start towards the end. And this will create a sequence that we get to customize on our own. The range function only works with integer values. It can be both negative and positive, just that it has to make sense. So if we're starting from a negative value and going towards a positive value, make sure that the end value is greater than the start value. So let's look at an example here. I have a problem here. We want to print all positive integers greater than 1 and less than 101 starting from 101. And our solution will be for this iterating variable that we get to name on our own, which I decided to call odd_num. In range, we're going to create a sequence. I want to look at all the numbers from 101 to 1, and I'm going to go down by 2, so I'm doing -2. I'm subtracting 2 from 101 every time as I loop through this iteration. All right, and when that odd num variable is a odd number, as in if odd_num modulus 2 doesn't equal to 0, then we're going to print that value. And this is our nice and handy for loop solution for printing all positive integers greater than 1, less than 101 starting from 101. So that was an example of using a for loop. What I want to do is now compare a while loop solution and a for loop solution. So let's look at an example problem. We're going to create a program such that given a positive integer n, we're going to print the factors of that value. We're not going to worry about decimals. And remember that factors are numbers that we use to multiply to get another number. So for example, the number 4 has factors of 1, 2, and 4. So in our previous unit, we would use a while loop to solve this problem, where we would grab a user input of an integer value, and we're going to start from a variable called factor starting at 1. Okay? And we're first going to check if the user input was 1, then it only has one factor, so we're going to output the factor is 1. However, for any other number, we're just going to say that while our starting value divisor factor doesn't equal user input plus 1, we're going to say user input modulus factor equals 0, as in if this factor is a factor of user input, we're going to output that factor. And then we're going to increase our factor by 1 and check if it's a true factor of our given user input. If so, print the factor. If not, we're going to ignore that output. We can do this a little more elegantly with using a for loop, because we don't need to create now an incremental variable. So here, we're going to say user input is equal to the integer input of any positive integer that the user inputs. Then we're going to say for this iterating variable called numbers that represents each item in this sequence of values 1 towards user input plus 1. And if that numbers is a factor of user inputs, we're going to output that number. And so for problems that we know that has a beginning and an end with set sequences, a for loop is a much nicer way to solve such problems. So I'm going to show you now some for loop patterns. So in programming, I guess patterns are what we call like a design pattern, where for a certain situation, we follow this pattern. We follow the solutions to incorporate in our code so that we can solve various problems. So we're going to learn how to count up towards a number. So right now I have an upper limit variable that is the input of, we're going to get an integer of upper limit. And this for loop here is going to start at 0 and go up towards upper limit, but not including that value. And it's going to output the numbers from 0 all the way up towards upper limit. Next, we're going to count up by 3. So it's the exact same idea, but we're going to use now a triple parameter range function, where we're going to start from 0 and we're going to go up towards upper limit, but increase it by 3 every time. So if our upper limit was 10, it'll go 0, 3, 6, 9, and then n, because 9 plus 3 is 12, so we're going beyond the upper limit, so the for loop will stop at that point. Now, let's say we want to go downward, then we're going to put a starting value. Hopefully the value is greater than our ending value, which is currently -1. It's not inclusive of that value. So this loop here for nums in range of starting value, comma -1, and we're going to take away 1 from our starting value in every iteration. So in this case, we're going to output, let's say starting value is 10. It'll output 10. Then we subtract 1, so it becomes 9. The num will become 9. Then 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And 0 minus 1 will be -1, and we never include that last value, or the ending value of our range function, so it would stop at the output of 0. Lastly, a great thing about a for loop is that we can also loop through a string by character. So if I had a word input, as in if I had a string input, we can have an iterating variable represent each character of that string starting from the beginning. So if the word was hello, character will first be H, then the second iteration will be E, then the third iteration will be L, fourth iteration will be L, and the fifth iteration will be O. And this way we get to do and solve a lot more complex problems, especially dealing with strings, which you will see in the worksheet. So today we just looked at some examples of what a for loop is, and we got to learn a new function, which was the range function that helps us create sequences of integers starting from one value towards the other. Then we compared how a solution can be done both in a while loop fashion and a for loop fashion. Then we looked at some patterns where we get to use for loops for different scenarios that we may encounter. We'll talk about this more as we go through in this unit. But thank you for watching. Stay classy.